Hey everyone, welcome back. So my name's Rob, and this is a course on an introduction to statistics for the psychological sciences. This is our second lecture in the course, and it covers 2 chapters worth of material. Broadly, it's on statistics and how statistics kind of fit into the field of science more generally, as well as we'll go over basic mathematical notation, basic concepts involved in measurement. But given the scope of material in this lecture, I decided to chunk it down into 4 separate lectures. So in this first one, we're going to go over just where statistics is in the context of science. And when you talk about science, we'll go back to grade school when we were talking about, when you learned about the scientific method, right? So the scientific method is a way of coming to knowledge about a topic, right? And specifically, this method, it starts with asking some kind of interesting question that you have. As a psychologist, that question is naturally going to be about why people do things the way they do, why people feel the way they feel, why people behave the way that they do. When you have this question, you're going to construct some kind of specific testable hypothesis. You're going to make a prediction about what is going to happen, and then you're going to conduct an experiment that's controlled, right? And you're going to be open to whatever happens, right? And whenever you conduct the experiment, you're going to get data. Well, that data has to be analyzed. And the way we analyze this data in psychology is with statistics. Now, so the 4 steps above analyzing your data, those are all going to be part of your research methods class, which you'll take after this. And you'll go into much more detail about research methods and how this scientific method is working in psychology. And we'll do a little bit of that here, but only in the service of helping you understand terminology used when analyzing data. So basically, we are going to talk about language and terminology used in experimental methods, but in this class, it's typically in the service of statistical analysis and setting up how we're going to do a statistical analysis. So how do you know when something is true, right? So the scientific method is one way that we can come to knowledge, but there are other ways that we can come to knowledge. So let's think of a question and try to figure out what ways we use to come to knowledge about an answer to that question. So let's start with the idea, say we're wondering, do birds of a feather flock together or do opposites attract? Right? So this is an age-old question, right, that people have had. One way you could come to a feeling of knowledge is through intuition. And intuition represents knowledge about behavior that's based on opinion or on faith or on belief or on just feeling that it's right. Sometimes, it just seems like it's common sense, right? So do birds of a feather flock together or do opposites attract? Well, if you ask people that, you get mixed decisions, right? So some people think it's common sense that birds of a feather flock together. Some people think it's opposites attract. But who's right? Well, it's hard to tell on the basis of intuition. Another way that we come to knowledge is by relying on an authority, right? So someone who is a trustworthy source, who has been accurate in the past. We might, for example, consult with a medical professional if we have a disease. That certainly sounds like a good idea. And oftentimes relying on authorities and people who have authority in a field is a great way to come to knowledge. Certainly, probably more reliable than intuition alone. However, authority isn't always the correct way. I mean, people can be wrong. Authority figures can be wrong. So just because they have expertise in an area doesn't mean they're right. So, like, for example, if we're asking about are birds of a feather opposites attract? Well, one person who you might consider an authority on the topic, who wrote a very, very, very popular song about it, was Paula Abdul, right? She wrote Opposites Attract, sang it with her cartoon fox-looking figure. Was she right? Was she wrong? Well, we don't know. Clearly, she fell on the side of opposites attract. So another way that we can come to knowledge is through rational inductive argument. And this is basically taking axioms or facts that we have confidence in and kind of combining them so that we can make new knowledge through inductive argument, right? So basically, if we all agree on some axiom, like, for example, I could say, all psychologists like dogs. If we agree on that, then we can move on to the next thing. I am a psychologist. And then you can conclude, therefore, I like dogs, right? And this is, rational inductive argument is the traditional means of gathering knowledge in math, in history, philosophy, literature. I mean, we can probably all remember in geometry when we were taught that interior angles of a triangle were proven to add up to 180 degrees, right? Well, sure, this is certainly a very strong way to come to knowledge, but let's apply it to our example of birds of a feather flock together, opposites attract. So I could say, well, I kind of like my friends. I tend to like my friends more than I like people who are totally different from me. My friends are similar to me. Therefore, I like people who are similar to me. So rational inductive argument in that case, this is an example of how birds of a feather flock together. But then this last type of coming to knowledge that we'll discuss is empirical knowledge, right? So this method of knowledge relies predominantly on the scientific method, right? So now empiricism and science aren't necessarily the exact same thing. Something that's empirical is something that's verifiable. It's also falsifiable. Science includes this with systematic observation, right? Where we observe all evidence and we're open to whatever happens. So if we have some pet theory that we want to be true, if the evidence turn out otherwise, we, on the basis of the scientific method, would need to accept that. And so science has a way of reducing bias, right? And basically, again, the scientific method is we come up with some kind of guess or hypothesis about why people do what they do, or how two things are related, or why they're related. We determine what would be a good base of evidence to demonstrate the knowledge I hypothesize. Then we collect data and try to analyze this data to test our hypothesis. And then we defend our conclusion on the basis of the quality of our data and the appropriateness of how we evaluated that data. So one important thing that I want to be loud and clear about out of the gate in this class is that when we're using an empirical method, we never claim to find something with proof. We don't prove things in science, right? That may be shocking, but this is true. Science does not prove. Proving things comes from the proper application of the rational inductive process, right? So proofs from geometry, those are proving things. And proof requires starting with an axiom that is definitely true. But in psychology, there are no axioms about behavior. We have no place to start the rational inductive process, right? What we do is we need to find probabilistic evidence, right? There's no one study is ever conclusive. And it's when we predict behavior, we're predicting the probability that a behavior is going to occur. So evidence in psychology is based on probability. And we can determine probabilities on the basics of statistics, right? Statistical results provide probability that a hypothesis is accurate. So, but what about, if someone made some kind of crazy claim that there was a teapot that was in orbit around the Earth? Could science prove this person right or wrong? Well, first off, in the absence of evidence, science would make no claim about whether there is a teapot orbiting the Earth. And this is because the onus of the claim is placed on the person who's claiming it's true, right? If it's the person who claims the teapot is out there that needs to provide the evidence for it. And if they can't provide that evidence, well, then it's certainly not any kind of claim that a scientist would take stake in, because scientific knowledge is rooted in empirical systemic observation. So, but on the flip side, I want to point out that it's also not possible to disprove that a teapot is orbiting the Earth. We could hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt. You can always argue, oh, it was over here when you were looking over here, right? And so this would not be a falsifiable claim. And this is an important thing in science, right? We must structure the test of our hypotheses in such a way that they're falsifiable, right? And in fact, what science shows is not what's true, but what is not true, right? So science doesn't prove that this is true. It provides evidence in support of something being true, but it never stakes a claim on it being true. It never says this is the only truth. And in that way, science is quite humble in that it remains open. It never says it has the full facts. It says it's more likely that this is true, but we know this isn't true. We can falsify this, right? And so a claim, in order for science to work, claims need to be falsifiable. Okay, so let's just do a real quick review here. So say Kyle believes that there's an afterlife because his minister asserted that this is the case. What method of knowledge would Kyle be using to come up with this? It would be authority, right? Because he's relying on an expert, on his minister. So here's another one. So Beth believes that black holes exist because she heard that a Nobel laureate published a study asserting that this is the case. Which method of knowing is she using? It's the same, right? Authority. Just because a person won a Nobel Prize does not mean that everything that they say is true. It doesn't mean that everything that they say is false either. This is just a way of people tend to come to knowledge. So let's look at a third example. So Sean wants to know if watching violent television results in higher violent behavior. And so Sean conducts an experiment, right? And what he does is there's a random group of people, and he takes people at random from that group, and with the flip of a coin determines whether they go into an experimental group or go into a control group. In the experimental group, the people who were randomized to that have to watch 3 hours per day of violent television. In the control group, those people have to watch 3 hours a day of nonviolent television. Then after that, their behavior is measured by a blind observer, and he assesses how much violent behavior occurred in the experimental group and how much violent behavior occurred in the control group. So what kind of method would Sean be using? He's using empirical knowledge, right? He set up an experiment. He had a hypothesis, set up an experiment, collected data, and he needs to analyze it now, right? But Sean was also using an experimental method, right? So an experimental method is when an investigator attempts to determine if changes in an independent variable, which an independent variable, you can think of it as the predictor or the variable that causes the change in the outcome. So the investigator manipulates or controls who gets what of the independent variable, violent versus nonviolent TV, right? And in an experimental method, you want to see if manipulating that independent variable causes a change in an outcome. Typically, that outcome is referred to as the dependent variable, right? In this case, it would have been violent behavior, right? So this is a key thing. An experimental method is where you have some outcome of interest, and then you determine who gets what of the independent variable to see if that one variable causes a change in the outcome. So in addition to the experimental method, Sean also used inferential statistics. So inferential statistics are a way that we can collect data from a small group of people in an attempt to make an inference about a larger population of people, right? And so this is a topic that warrants considerably more detail than we're going to get through in this short little lecture. But I just wanted to kind of let you know where we'll be going. So in the second part of the lecture, we're going to dive a bit deeper into some of the key scientific concepts that are used in statistics for the psychological sciences, such as the distinction between descriptive and inferential statistics. And we'll go through some of the vocabulary and definitions in the next lecture, which are going to be tremendously important and serve as foundational building blocks on which this entire course is going to be built. Right? So it's very important that you have on rapid fire that you can distinguish between an independent variable and a dependent variable. But we'll do more practice next lecture. We'll also discuss different types of samples, the differences between what a sample is and what a population is, how all of that relates to statistics. We'll also discuss various types of variables, common ways studies are designed, and some of the gold standards of appropriately conducting scientific research. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you found this video helpful, please don't forget to smash that like button. And you can always subscribe to the channel on YouTube. If you do, hit the notification bell and you'll be immediately updated anytime I post new lecture content for the course. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next part of this lecture.